Well, good morning and welcome to Facebook Live this morning with Tom and myself. As you know, Lily isn't able to join us, and so I'm going to be meeting with Tom. Able to join us, and so I'm going to be talking to Tom this morning. We're going to be talking about Earth Day. And I think it's very relevant that Earth Day this week occurs in Easter week. And some people, of course, call this Earth Week. And I just wanted to start us before we get into it with a quote from this book, Worshipping in Season, Ecology and Christ Through the Liturgical Year. Very interesting book and a very helpful book. And the author says, liturgically, Ash Wednesday launches us on a Lenten journey that concludes in many churches with baptismal waters on Easter, waters of renewal and of rebirth. We see how Earth walks with us, walks in us on this journey. And so I think, you know, it's very relevant that this is the same week, Easter week and Earth week. And he goes on to say, when Earth is nourished with living water, when our bodies are bathed in the living water of Christ, the living earth of both the ground and of ourselves grows and bears fruit. Isn't that beautiful? Just to join these two things together, I think is wonderful. A couple of things before I start. Firstly, our dog Goldie doesn't like it when Tom and I are on Zoom calls together. And so she tries to get things to distract us. And she's just gone and picked something off my desk to do that. So I might have to get up while Tom's talking and, stop that. I'm sorry. But, kind of this is life happening here. Facebook Live, it's life. So anyway, we're going to talk about Earth Day now. And I want Tom to start with why, Tom, does Earth Day matter to you?
Well, and let me say, Christine, it's such a delight to be with you. I'm so proud of what you created here. Thank you for letting me participate. That first Earth Day for me was really something like a second conversion experience. I was working as Dean of Students at Maui Community College in Hawaii. As a young 30-something, I prided myself on keeping up on what we used to call current events. But there was no sense for me and many others that the world was really changing. Well, that all ended on that first Earth Day because Dr. James Dater, a professor at the University of Hawaii, came to Maui Community College and spoke on that very first day about a daunting range of environmental challenges that were likely to face us in the immediate future. And many of those now have come to pass, and we have been experiencing what he predicted. But on that day, there were a few faculty and a lot of students, and 50 of those students were so moved by what Dr. Dater said that they actually went out and started walking towards a motel 3 blocks from the community college, and it was right on the ocean. And there on the beach were huge mountains of garbage. I had no idea what the students were up to, but they brought bags. They captured all that garbage in about 50 bags, took it into the lobby and did a student protest. Well, you didn't stand up to officials in days like that, even motel managers, but they did. They stayed there all day until he promised not to do it anymore. and he promised to hire a garbage service and deal with that. Well, I had to deal with a new reality. I had no idea we were facing environmental challenges or other change. I found within 6 weeks, I actually made a decision and moved to Seattle to pursue a doctorate in history, intellectual history, which is my field, but with a minor in forecasting, because I realized that I wasn't the only one that was a part of the Out to Lunch bunch. There are a lot of pastors who are still operating like it'll always be the 90s, because they are not trained like business innovators, urban planners, environmental planners to forecast the new challenges. So I took that training, and ever since then, my first book, Mustard Seed Conspiracy, and the newest book that Dwight Friesen and I have written is 220's Foresight, 3 Vital Practices for Thriving in a Decade of Accelerating Change, designed as a study book to help pastors and lay leaders learn to do 2 things. Number 1, anticipate some of the new challenges and some of the new opportunities that are facing Gen Next. Every church I've worked with loves their young people, but I've never found a church that's anticipating what are they going to be facing with school debt, the housing costs that are going up, and what are options like new forms of community living. So that was a life-changing day for me, and it's still going on. And I urge all of you to take the time not only to celebrate Earth Day, but to join environmental planners and urban planners who emphasize the need to both anticipate the new challenges and opportunities, and then to research broadly a range of new ways to respond in our lives, in our churches, and in community change making.
Well, and for me, it wasn't quite as radical a change as it was for Tom. I think that I'd already had my wake-up call when a few years earlier, I had read Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. I mean, that really rattled my cage and made me realize just how important it was that I took the environment seriously, and I took our care for creation seriously. And so that was what laid the seeds for me. And then when I became a keen gardener, it just grew and blossomed, I suppose you could say, because part of what I realized was that my understanding of the gospel stories wasn't complete without the understanding of how God was revealed through creation. And it was just, again, it was a profound kind of experience that deepened my faith as I saw the life, death, and resurrection of Christ lived out in the garden, and continue to see that. It's just so phenomenal for me, and it's something that has become a very important part of my faith and continues to be as well. So I just, and at that time, at the same time, I started to look for theology books on that dealt with this aspect of theology, theology from an ecological perspective. And when I first started looking for that, when I was a young and keen gardener, it was really hard to find them. And one of the things that I think I'm very grateful for over the last few years is that there have been a lot of books that have been published on this subject, and coming from different kind of perspectives. And I love those, and we're going to mention a few of those in a moment. But I think that this Earth Day and Earth Week and its convergence with the Easter week, as it does this year, it doesn't always converge, but the convergence, I think, is just really important, because it says this is the time for new life, this is the time for new creation, this is the time when these things come together in a way that is really, really important. So I should have, sorry, one of the things I should have mentioned is that if you have a comment to make, or if you have a question to ask, I have got my phone out so that if you write them as comments on this post, on the Facebook Live, then I can answer or comment on these things as well.
And we can have conversation.
And we can have a little bit of a conversation at least. But my second question for Tom is, how does your concern for creation impact your life and ministry now?
Oh, goodness. It really goes back, for our British viewers, to discovering Iona and Celtic Christian faith, because I developed a whole new insight that the Celtic faith doesn't see the created order as many of us in the West do, including Christians, as the stuff we use, to heat our homes and we purchase at the stores. They didn't see God's creation in utilitarian terms. They saw it as sacred. They said prayers when they lit their fires in the morning. They said prayers when they planted their seeds in the garden. They saw it all as a realm of the creation of God. And the utilitarian notion is a concern to me today, because so many people who really love God have bought into a very individualistic Western culture where we see the things that are part of creation is just the stuff we use, the Instagram envy, the kind of consumer-oriented society. There's another book that's been written by James K. Smith entitled "You Are What You Love." And he makes the case that the water we swim in, that is the values that we embrace in a consumer culture, define who we are and what we value much more than we followers of Jesus recognize. So the call in the books that Christina and I write is a call to a whole life faith. It isn't a little devotional add-on to my very busy consumer life. In fact, we shouldn't be deriving our life satisfaction by what we purchase, what we display, or the houses we live in. And that's not an easy message to share. Mennonites are in the forefront of calling us to a more serious whole life faith. But evangelicals and mainline Christians all over the planet, following Jesus is a whole life deal. It's not a little devotional add-on.
Well, like Tom, I was impacted by Celtic Christian spirituality, and I loved that idea, of course, getting into the garden. I really loved that idea that the Celts would pray over their seeds. In fact, what they would do, they would always try to plant seeds on a Friday, and they would sprinkle them with water when they planted them. And so they would do it, I think actually they would sprinkle them a few days beforehand. So it was planted in an enactment of a conscious enactment of the death and resurrection of Christ every time they planted seeds. And I think that is beautiful. And I remember talking to African people about this, African Christians, and they got so excited because part of what they hated about the way they'd been taught Christianity was the fact that it was so divorced from the way that they lived out their lives. And it didn't have this kind of interaction. And Celtic Christian spirituality did. And of course, indigenous theology does as well. And I think part of what we've loved over the last few years, and I, this does go into how it's lived out in my life, is our growing connection to people like Randy Woodley, a Native American theologian, farmer, and community builder as well. He lives down in Oregon, and I've actually been using his book, Becoming Rooted, lovely little devotional book. I wish I had time to read out one of the devotions for you in this book, but it's well worth getting hold of. It's 100 devotions, and I used it through the Easter season, and I'm still using it. It's not quite in sync with the way he'd intended it, but I am, and just loving it. And I think that our connection to people who have a much greater understanding of the land and of its importance like this is really encouraging. And then, of course, Wendell Berry, reading Wendell Berry, reading Norm Wurzbur's books, are some of the things that have also really impacted my ministry. And that's one of the reasons that Tom and I live in community, and why part of our community value is growing as much of our own produce as possible.
Can I just follow on to that? In fact, last year we have a house ancient for the West Coast, 1910, and it's actually 3 two-bedroom apartments stacked on top of each other. Last year, we grew and enjoyed 100 pounds of tomatoes. We had 400 pounds of apples off 3 little apple trees. We garden together once a month. We have a meal together once a week. But back to Randy Woodley, early in our...
Well, and let me just say that we think that community living is a better way to live, and it really does have less of an imprint on the creation too.
We're able to give young couples that are interested in a community living experience reduced rent. And we get together for a meal once a week, as I said. We garden together once a month, and it's another way of being. But early in our relationship, because of the influence of First Nations people, I started looking for some land to purchase to try to do something where we could draw on the insights of Celtic spirituality. Well, the tribal group that I met with, there was no way we could work out the 99-year lease. So I went to a place just an hour out of Seattle called Camino Island, and I found 40 acres. I mortgaged our house to buy the 40 acres, and we started a Celtic retreat center. We would have a celebration once a year where we, using Celtic spirituality, and we have a gentleman that does the music that goes along, that draws on that tradition, and we would have large retreats. We built a building. We wanted to have a retreat site, but tragically, some vandals destroyed major parts of the building. And getting older, we realized we didn't have enough sand left in our hourglass to finish this project. So we deeded it over to James Amadin, and he's a young pastor, retired now from the Covenant Church, and he has started Circlewood. So check out Circlewood.
Yeah, it's grown out of Mustard Seed Associates.
Yes.
And I think for Tom and I, this was the purpose for this land.
Yes.
And so we're excited to see it developing into an educational center that will put creation care at the center of discipleship.
That's right. And I'm still going to be going out there. I hope you can go with me.
Yeah, we're looking forward to opportunities, hopefully over the summer this year and more in the future, to go out and to be a part of what James and Forrest and some of the others will be doing out there. Because, to bring creation care into the center of who we are and how we operate, I think is just so, so important. And that's where we can learn, I think, particularly from the Celtic and from the indigenous peoples, because they are so much more connected to the land.
But something we both say in our writings is that the call to follow Jesus is a call to a whole life faith. It isn't a little devotional add-on to real life. It is real life. And so we encourage people to think about doing retreats once or twice a year. We do it twice a year, where we get away to refocus our lives, to chart a direction for our individual spiritual lives, our daily time with scripture and prayer, but also our retreat times to discover new ways to follow Jesus, to be better partners and to be better neighbors. because the call to follow Christ, we need to free up time daily to be present to God. We need to find time weekly to be present to neighbors and not just have a little faith showing up twice a month to a church facility. Because right now, my forecast that we talked about in 220's foresight is the Western church is facing a crisis decade. We're seeing since COVID came up, we're going to see a continuing decline in attendance and giving and in reaching out in mission.
Well, and I think part of the reason for that is that younger people are much more interested in an expression of a whole life faith.
Right.
And they feel disillusioned by a lot of older people who don't seem to be concerned about issues of creation, about issues of justice. I mean, you know, and of course, justice and creation care, I think are they're really bound together in a lot of ways. I was actually just reading a book that I've been given to read before it's published this morning. It's Norm Wordsworth's latest book, and I was just horrified where he was talking about how, because of the injustice and the racism in the early 1900s, that something like 98% of African-American farmers were pushed off the land.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, that's both an issue of justice and it's an issue of creation care, you know, and wow.
Well, let me just bring in some good news that many people have not heard in the church. Most pastors in the United States know that the forecast that Gen Y and Gen Z, the under 50, are not going to affiliate with the church. Pew Research has been predicting that for a decade. It is coming true. But I rarely run into pastors or lay leaders to know the good news about the Western church is that young people in these two generations, Y and Z, because they're the first digital generation, really care about creation. They care about neighbors. And a higher percentage of these two generations want to be involved in working for economic justice, racial justice, environmental justice, and they want to create ways to do that. There are very few churches that are not trying to get them converted in the pews first, but they're trying to work with them in neighborhoods to help them launch neighborhood social enterprise projects to make a difference in the neighborhood, and then trust God to help build the bridge back to the church. We need a little more imagination. I wrote a book a few years ago with a rude title, Live Like You Give a Damn, Join the Change-Making Generation. And you can still find that, it's still available. But it's a call to help churches start to work with young people who are not members to do neighborhood change making. We're going to inhabit a local event where that's going on big time with this group that we're going to be with this weekend. But in all of our Western countries, all over the world, we need to invite young people who really do care about the neighborhood and the environment to become launched in doing things that make a difference and discover in that journey that there is a Jesus behind all that we speak.
Well, and I think too, you know, one of the things that young people are very aware of is that, you know, most of them live in the city, or at least they live in urban areas. And, you know, so often what people say out of the Bible is that the Bible story begins in a garden and it ends in a city. And it's almost like, you know, let's forget about creation. And I think the exact opposite is true, because if you look at that image in Revelation of the city, it's this beautiful garden city. Yes. And I think part of what all of us can work towards is, you know, helping to make our cities into garden cities. In this book that I'm reading at the moment for an endorsement by Norm Wordsworth, he talks about how you look at the skyline of our cities, and he said it's not creation care that most of them show that they're interested in, it's money, it's wealth. And so how do we bring that concern for creation, not just into the center of discipleship, but into the center of the way that we lived. Part of what I really appreciate about our utility company here is that, we pay an extra premium for purchasing renewable energy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that those kind of steps are little steps that a lot of us can make. I know not all, because not all can afford those kind of steps, but there really are ways that we can show more concern for creation. Using public transport is another one, because, public transport obviously is less polluting, and it's less kind of, all the reasons for that. We can use less plastic, because plastic, of course, is something that is an absolute disaster. And if anybody here in Seattle needs storage jars to get rid of plastic, I have a whole cupboard full of them that I hate to throw into the recycle bin, because I think, there are people that could use these to replace their plastic with glass storage, because it's a lot more durable. And, there are some simple ways, or maybe getting involved in a community garden. That's another thing that I think all of us can do. And that doesn't mean we have to, necessarily know a lot about gardening. In fact, we could do with some help in our garden. And I can teach people the basics of gardening and how we can grow some of our own food. Because it's not just what Tom mentioned. We try and grow about 40% of our own fruit and vegetables. It's probably a bit less at the moment, but there is a way that all of us can be more sensitive to the fact that we need green spaces around us.
And one of the things I've done before the pandemic, and I had an opportunity to do a Futures Creativity Workshop, which I've done in Britain and Australia, Canada, and the United States. And so the Presbyterian Church, and they came up with some lovely ideas. It's a church that has no young people, no young families right now. And so one of their creative ideas out of this session was to actually have art classes for elementary school students, so parents don't have to pay this huge amount for childcare after they get out of school. They're doing art, and it's free and it's protected. And for junior high school people, that they have a separate program there to train them how to do neighborhood change making and make a difference. And they talked about starting community gardens because there are a lot of people who would like to grow their own. Housing in the United States has become outrageous. The standard house in this community was $700,000. And most young families can't afford that. So they're also trying to get policies developed for intergenerational housing, much less expensive, less land use. But we want to help churches and ignite the creativity of their members to create new ways to be a difference and make a difference that reflects the ways of Jesus Christ.
Amen. Well, and just as we finish here, Tom, what are some resources that you recommend? Top of my list at the moment, because I'm reading it, is this Worshipping in Season, but then also Randy Woodley's book, Shalom and the Community of Creation. It's an excellent place to start.
Let me get a couple books.
Tom's going to get a couple more books. And then also, I think some Celtic books, because I think that again, the Celtic worldview is something that really does help us in this too. But remember that this is both Earth Week and Easter Week. And I love that. I wish it happened every year. But I think it's something that we need to realize, that every Easter week, I think in many ways, is Earth Week, because it is a time when we remember the renewal, the recreation, the renewal and the rebirth of creation, and the fact that Jesus is the gardener of the new creation. Jesus is basically a gardener in many ways, and I think we do need to remember that. So what books do you recommend, Lum?
Well, this one is called Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul by John Philip Newell, and it is an amazing book, amazing book on Celtic spirituality, and makes a good case. Our dog is barking at the door. An important book called Making Room by Christine Pohl. And this is important because she does a study of the first century church. They did not meet in church buildings. As followers of Jesus, they became a new family across race, class, nationality, socioeconomic. They lived together as a new family that the world had never seen before. There weren't this racial or other divides. They became one family in Jesus Christ. And then, forgive me, but my book that I mentioned at the beginning, 220's Foresight, 3 Vital Practices, is designed as a book to help you anticipate the new challenges and join those who are creating new ways to be a difference and make a difference that reflects the way of Jesus.
Amen. And as you know, there are a lot of resources on God's Space Light. There's a whole section in our resource library of blog posts and books and podcasts and things like this on creation care. So I really recommend that to you. And in speaking about podcasts, I must mention before we finish that Circlewood has a wonderful podcast hosted by James Armiden and Forrest Inslee, and it's called Earth Keepers. And
Please
highly recommend it to you. It's just very, very good. So there are some basic resources to start with. And so we hope that you will take advantage of these and that you will maybe join us again for another of these sessions.
And can I just say a very belated, joyous Easter to you all. We are so grateful to have sisters and brothers all over the world that Christine is connected with. God bless you and God help you live fully on this as we go into New Earth Day and a very troubled time on this planet.
Amen. Thank you for joining us.